A method is a way to write a bit of code that you can reuse in various places throughout your code. So just like we see in this diagram, you write your code here, and then you can call that method at other points throughout your code, and it will basically tell the program to run the code that you've already written up here. And you can call it as many times as you need in different parts of your code. So let's learn how to write a method. Here in this tutorial, you can follow this step by step, but I'm going to walk you through it in Eclipse right now. And afterwards, you should feel comfortable writing a simple method. So let's delete this code from the last exercise. There we go. And we're going to write a method. Now, it's important to know that when you write a method, you write it outside of your main method, because if you wrote it inside, it would get confused. Java would see this main method, and inside it would see another method. So we're going to write it outside, and we're going to write it just here above. And let's call this method, we're going to write one, we're going to follow the example here in the exercise, and write one that will read both temperatures and print them out. So we could write these 4 lines of code every time we want to do this, or we could put them inside a method, and then every time we can just call this method and these 4 lines of code will run. So because this method isn't going to actually return a value, it's just going to run some code, we're going to start out by writing void. And this means that when we call the method, it's not expected to return a specific value. Later we'll talk about how to write a method that does return a value. So we'll write void, and then we're going to name our method. This method we'll call, let's see what we called it in the example. We'll call this method read temps. And then afterwards we put 2 parentheses and an opening and closing bracket. And that in its simplest form is a method, but it doesn't do anything yet. So inside this method, inside of these brackets, we're going to write the code that we want it to execute. So in this case, we want it to read both temperatures to variables and then print those variables out. And then in order to read the variable, of course, we'll need to import JTC_lab. And create a JTC_lab object. Now we'll read our second temperature into a second variable. And then we'll print them both out. And when we run our program, it doesn't do anything yet because we're not calling the method. This is just outlining what we want the method to do. But in order to actually see anything happen, in our main method, we have to call this method. So to call it, we just write the name of the method, followed by 2 parentheses and a semicolon. And we're getting one error, and that's because we defined this method just here in the main class, not inside anything else, we need to right here before this variable name, we need to write static. Or pardon me, the static goes right here before the void. And that's just something we have to do anytime we have a variable or method that we just declare right here in the main method that's not part of any, it's not meant to be used as part of any object or anything. So we'll explain a little bit more about that in the next lesson when we talk about classes and objects. But let's try running this now, and you'll see because we called our method here in the main method, the program will start the program, and it will start running right here on the main method and run everything inside. And as soon as it gets to this line, this will point it back to this method, and it will run all the code inside this method. And we can see that now, because we called this method, it does indeed go back and run this code, and it prints out the two temperatures. And then of course, after this, it's always wise to use mylab.close to close and disconnect from the lab. So we'll run that one more time so that it shuts down. And you see that it disconnects correctly. So let's switch back here to the lesson and talk a little bit about method returns. So a method return is when you want the method to run code and then return a value back that you can read almost like it's a variable. So a method return, to write a method return, you just write the word return followed by the value you want to return. This is an example of a method that returns a string every time that says my function ran. This is an example that returns the integer 52. And this example returns a variable. It returns the value of a variable named product. The method returns is what you're actually getting back when you use methods. For instance, in the JTCLab library, you use the methods T1 and T2 to get the temperatures from the temperature control lab. But these are actually methods that are returning a value. They're returning a double value that represents that temperature. The next thing we need to talk about is method parameters. So in the previous methods that we've written, we didn't put anything inside the parentheses. But if you want to write a method that includes method parameters, you would write those right here in the parentheses. Now what do I mean when I say parameters? Well, parameters are special variables that are specific to every time a method is called. Here's an example of a method that's meant to multiply two numbers. And when the method is called, just like you see right here, you pass it two arguments. And these go in as parameters. You can pass it any number you want. They're separated by commas, but then that message basically goes up here to the original method, and it plugs in the values that are in the method call for these variables. And then inside the method, you can use the variable a and the variable b, but when you call the method, it'll substitute those out, just like a regular variable, for these actual numbers. And then the last thing that you need to know is when you have a method that's meant to return a value, you can use it just like any variable or any value. So right here, we have a print statement, and inside that print statement, we call this method multiply with the numbers 5 and 12. So what this will do is it'll print the return of this method. So this method will come up here, it'll run this code, it'll plug in 5 for A and 12 for B, and it will return the two multiplied, and it will end up printing out the value of 5 and 12 multiplied, which is 60. Okay, now let's take a look at this activity and walk through it together. In this activity, we're going to be writing a Boolean method. That means it's going to return a Boolean, a true or a false value, and it's going to take in one integer, and if that integer is even, it will return false, and if the integer is not even, it will return true, if the integer is even, and it will return false if the integer is not even. So let's look at how to do this. This gives us a little bit of a hint on how to tell if it's even or not. We can use the modulus operator because if a number divided by 2 has a remainder of 0, then it's even, and if the modulus, or the remainder after dividing it by 2, is more than 0, or 1, then it's odd. So let's go back over to Eclipse here, and let's delete this method that we just wrote. And now we're going to write our Boolean method. So we start out by writing static, and then Boolean because it's going to return a Boolean value. And then we're going to name our method isEven. And this is going to take as a parameter an integer variable. and I'll name that variable a. And then inside, we need to return the result of a Boolean statement. So up here you see another example of a Boolean statement. Right here, this is a Boolean statement to test whether 5 plus 8 equals 10. And of course it doesn't, and so this equates to false, and the value of this Boolean variable is false. In the same way, we can return the value of a Boolean equation. So right here we can just type return a modulus 2 is equal to 0. And if a divided by 2 has a remainder of 0, it will return true. If a divided by 2 has a remainder other than 0, it will return false. So now let's try using this method down here. Let's write a method call, and we're going to print out the return of this method. So system.out.println is even, and let's first pass it in an odd number, so it should return false. And we'll run our code, and it does indeed return false. Now let's try an even number. Let's try 100. And if we run our code again, it prints out true. So that's a great way to write a bit of code that you have to use over and over. Imagine if we had a complicated program that had to be constantly figuring out if a number was odd or even. Rather than writing this whole equation, we could just write this little method that's sort of like a machine that takes in a number and spits out another number. So that's our overview of methods. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. And if not, I'll see you in the next video.